Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank the High Commissioner and his team for an extraordinary initiative. I want to apologize in advance for reducing human mobility, an extremely complex phenomenon that is as old as human civilization and as consequential as any in the history of mankind, into a few dozen sentences. But nonetheless, that's what I will try to do. Allow me to start from a rather simple premise, that societies internally and nations across organize themselves more readily when they share a common understanding of a threat and or self-interest. And I think international migration meets both of these tests. And my few comments today will follow this simple premise. I have been listening with fascination for the last day and a half because I'm convinced, as I suspect most of us are, that every worthwhile exercise requires a dynamic balance between poetry, if you will allow me, and plumbing. Thankfully, we have heard an awful lot of poetry for the past day and a half. So if you will allow me, I will be the plumber today. So I will try to put one practical idea on the table. The international migration system itself is limping along. There's too much rhetoric and too little practical ideas. And if we're going to make progress, we're going to have to come up with more practical ideas that take better into account the interests of sending communities and societies, the interests of receiving communities and societies, and the interests of the immigrants themselves. And great aspirational statements about, new bodies and international conventions, etc., will simply not do if you have the modest goals that I am going to propose here of building up from the bottom up, of coming up with baby steps, with experiments, with the hoped-for objective of demonstrating success in a policy area where virtually all of our own experiences have been ones of failure, or at least they are reduced to a narrative that emphasizes failure, whether failure is indeed the outcome or not. I want to suggest that we need less talk, especially between Europe and other parts in the European neighborhood, and more real programs. Programs that are bilateral and sub-regional. Programs that are tested and evaluated, and programs that can then be emulated, copied, if you will, after they have become sort of readapted to different regional and sub-regional settings. Let me suggest that we all focus all too often on the opportunities that international migration creates. And indeed, international migration creates enormous opportunities, and many speakers have referred to them. But I wanted to focus on the problems, the challenges that international migration creates, and on three sets of challenges. I know that there are many. People have talked about integration. We could have a conversation about social cohesion, about divided families, about unequal labor and social rights, etc., etc. And all of these are worthwhile topics for discussion in any serious conversation about international migration. But I think three sets of problems that seem to capture most of the concerns of most people are the following: that there is too much illegality, that there is too much disorder, and chaos. And there are too many deaths, too much insecurity, too much exploitation. So the objective of any practical next steps should be to replace all of these problems with legality, with orderliness, and with safety. And I will close by suggesting one way that we might try to approach those three goals. And this is a rather modest policy proposal. It comes under all sorts of different names, but I'll use the name that perhaps is most familiar to this group: circular migration. The freer, I'm not saying free, I'm not saying open borders, but the freer movement of people back and forth in an organized, legal, safe way. Circularity, or circular migration, is in some ways opaque enough in that it means slightly different things to different people, that it can pass the initial political test. In other words, by meaning slightly different things to different people, politicians may actually adopt it linguistically. It arguably meets more of the immigrants and their households' complex objectives than most other forms of migration. And I believe it can act as more of a development instrument than any other form of migration. And finally, I think it can create, over time, more of the necessary virtuous cycles that tie sending and receiving society interests into a common set of objectives that can move us forward. Just to give you a few suggestions about sending society's interests. What sending societies most frequently want, and individual immigrants, and families, and households, they want work visas. They want the ability to move back and forth without losing their right in either of the two countries. They want the people who are engaged in migration to be treated more properly. And if you have a legal and orderly system, you can accomplish these goals. And receiving societies, whether they want to acknowledge it or not, they actually need workers. Mr. Chairman, you spoke about the demographic predicament that faces many of our countries. Not exactly the same way. Many of the European countries, as you know so well, actually face a double squeeze, as it were. There is no pipeline, too few births, and everybody is getting older. While not everybody has the problem of a birth dearth, everyone does in the advanced industrial world have the problem of an aging society. So an orderly system that moves people legally, that focuses on the rights, labor, social, and related rights of the people who will move and who will do the work that is necessary, can indeed also serve the interests of the receiving societies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.